think I start by talking a little bit about Jane, which probably could take quite a bit of this lecture time, Zoom time up. She was an undergraduate at Southampton University and then studied for her PhD on the fossil forests of the Upper Jurassic of Dorset. Now, she is living proof that there is life after dinosaurs in Dorset and in the British Isles and in the whole world. And then she went on to predominantly research posts and ended up in the University of Adelaide. And by this time, I think she was more or less committed to Arctic and Antarctic research. She was persuaded to come back to the UK by the University of Leeds. And there she started off as a lecturer and moved up the ladder, eventually becoming a professor of paleoclimatology and dean of a school. And I might add that during this time, she was a much wanted external examiner because of the formidable way that she undertook pedology, particularly when it came to assessments and so on. But we all benefited from it. But the ladder was not a terribly short one for her at Leeds, because soon after she left, she became Chancellor of the university. So it's great to have a paleobotanist as Chancellor of a very good university. It was in, I believe, around 213 that she left Leeds and became, for the first time, the first woman director of the British Antarctic Survey. And during that time, she received honorary degrees and medals, and in 2021 became a Fellow of the Royal Society. But throughout her existence at BAS, she's become a very much admired and desirable member of the international community when it comes to talking about strategy and problems of control over the Antarctica. And so when she was created a Dame, as part of her citation, it was for her diplomacy. So as well as being formidable, she can also be the diplomat. And I think well, for me, the most admirable thing of all of this is that during this whole period, she remained very active in research and has undertaken numerous expeditions to the Antarctic and actually collected an enormous number of fossils. So I believe that we might be hearing a little bit about these voyages of discovery in the Antarctic during this lecture. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Diane. And I'm delighted to be able to join you. So I'm going to share my screen and start my talk. So yes, it's funny you should talk about voyages of discovery, because I actually did go to Antarctica quite a lot on a ship, and I get terribly, terribly seasick. So actually it was very uncomfortable voyages of discovery, but it's been fantastic to work in both the Arctic and Antarctic. So I'm just going to actually take all of you on a journey tonight through time. So some of you may have heard a little bit about this, but I'm going to go from 100 million years ago, so there is a dinosaur in my talk, and come right up to present day and a little bit into the future. So we're going to cover about 100 million years of time in a short time, and a little bit further, but trying to make it very relevant to where we are today in terms of climate. So it says greenhouse to icehouse, and we'll look at some fossils as well. So some of them I've worked on for a very long time, and some of you may have seen them before, but a little bit extra at the end. So Antarctica is quite an amazing place, and here's a satellite image of Antarctica, and you can see that today it's mostly covered with ice, and in fact 4 kilometers thick in parts. And a lot of research that's going on today, especially at British Antarctic Survey, is looking at how the ice is actually melting. And it's interesting because with climate warming, the ice is not melting from the top of the ice cap as it is in Greenland, but in Antarctica the ice is so thick that actually it's fairly stable on the top at the moment. But the ice is melting from underneath. So the ice shelves around Antarctica are melting by warm water that's coming underneath the the underneath some of these ice shelves around Antarctica, and that may free up the glaciers, but that's another story. So there's a huge amount of fresh water locked up in Antarctica, and the big questions, research questions, are about what happens if all that ice melts, and of course the impact on the global sea levels. But not many people know that actually in the rocks in Antarctica, they represent a time when the Earth was much warmer and when there were forests and dinosaurs living on the continent. It looked a bit different from it does now. But if you go to Antarctica, you can roughly see, you can't see many rocks, but there are mountain tops here on the Transantarctic Mountains, and there you can see some brown bits here in Pridd's Bay. And all around here in the Antarctic Peninsula, there are sea cliffs, there are tops of mountains sticking amongst the ice, and there are some islands which have rocks exposed, and they all have, more or less all of them have fossil plants in them. So Antarctica was once a land which was a continent that was covered by terrestrial sediment. So there's lots of rivers flowing across there. There were lots of soils, and there were forests in there with animals in them. So that's what my research has been about. It's been about trying to understand how Antarctica, how the climate was in the past and what was on the continent. And it's actually more relevant today than it ever has been, because it's looking at a time when Antarctica was warm and changing quite fastly due to climate. And so maybe that's where we're going in future. Now, it's really important to understand, the reason I choose 100 million years is that's the time when the Antarctic continent started to sit over the South Pole. So this is a paleogeographic map of the Cretaceous, a sort of 100 million years ago when dinosaurs were on the Earth. And you can see here reconstructions by geologists who can reposition the continents in the past, and you can see the outline of the Earth that's quite recognizable. So South America, Africa, and India's moved away from Antarctica and moving towards the Himalayas, and you can see here the Antarctic continent still attached to Australia about 100 million years ago. And this actually was a land connection here between South America and the Antarctic at that time. And people often say to me, well, if you've got forests in Antarctica, that must mean the continent must have been over the equator. But we know that actually from about 100 million years ago, the Antarctic continent moved over the South Pole, and it hasn't moved hardly at all since then. So the history that we can gather from the rocks is actually the history of climate change, not about the tectonic movement of Antarctica. And I think that's really quite unique and very important. And what the fossils tell us, that there was warmth at the pole if we've got dinosaurs and plants there, which means that carbon dioxide levels were much higher, probably from about 1,000 parts per million, and roughly estimated, and probably from natural volcanic eruptions. But this is what it's like today. So the same continent, same position, covered in ice. There's a ship that I travelled on, and you can see some of the rocks there without grass, without buildings, beautifully exposed. And in all of those rocks, there are fossil leaves, there's petrified wood, and loads of pollen that tell us about the climate of the Antarctica millions of years ago. So here's some marine fossils. So I don't particularly work on marine fossils, but just a taster, you can see how beautifully preserved they are. So here you can see some ammonites here, beautiful ammonites. They're bivalves. They're these beautiful, amazing gastropods with the original shelly material on them. And they tell us a lot about what the seas were like about 100 million years ago, or 70 million years. These particular ones are 70 million years old at the end of the Cretaceous. And there are a lot of people that have done work on the shelly material that tells us that the seas around Antarctica were quite warm, probably about 15 degrees centigrade warm. So no major ice caps around in the Antarctic in the Cretaceous. So I'm going to show you quite a lot of these pictures and paintings. So I've worked with an artist called Robert Nichols, who's famous for his pictures of dinosaurs. And it's been a really, really interesting experience working with an artist, trying to trying to work with him to take the picture that's in my head when I've looked at all the fossils and sort of imagined this past world, and tried to explain to him how he can put this on a canvas. So this is one of the pictures that Robert has drawn for us. It's a oil painting, and if you come to the British Antarctic Survey in Cambridge, you can see the real thing, which is a big canvas about 1 meter across. So you can see here the Antarctic Peninsula, the mountains, and probably the Antarctic Peninsula, that bit that sticks up towards Antarctica, to South America, was probably really like the Andes. So high mountains you can see there, and you can see forests on the mountains, and I'll show you more of them later. And then in the ocean, so there's some of the reconstructions of the fossils that we found. So this big giant marine reptile called a mosasaur, huge creature eating a primitive shark. There are ammonites swimming in the oceans, which I showed you. There's fish. We have fossils of plesiosaurs. We have fossils of, this is another dinosaur that was lived on land. We have seabirds, and we have, from the sort of muddy bottom of the ocean, we have all those gastropods, bivalves, and a huge array of fossils that are so well preserved in the ocean sediments. So that's what the oceans are like. Also buried in those oceans, because in the ocean sediments, because from those forests on land, and the material from land, the leaves and the wood, was washed out into the ocean and has been then preserved in different ways. So it's really unique in that we've got a sequence of ocean sediments that have both ocean creatures in there and the evidence of what was on land as well. And we have this amazing sequence of, so you can see there top left, you can see fossil leaf, about 2 centimeters long, with very striking venation. You can see fossil wood there. So that's about blocks that are about 1 meter long. They're petrified by calcite, and the cellular structure is beautifully preserved. And then you can see pollen and spores there, which we also use to understand what the vegetation was like, because the pollen and spores beautifully preserved, really beautifully preserved in these sediments. And they can tell us what all the little plants in the undergrowth were like, that would never be petrified, never be preserved. And so there they are in all their beauty. And they tell us about the age of the sediments and what was really growing, the smaller plants in the forests. So beautifully preserved fossils. We also have fossils that are amazingly preserved as charcoal. So not surprisingly, if we had forests living on high mountains, volcanic arc like the Andes, there are volcanoes there in the Andes today in Chile, and occasionally they erupt, and they're also subject to thunderstorms and lightning, and there must have been forest fires there quite regularly. And when fossil plants, fossil wood burns and forms charcoal in the right conditions, you can see they form this beautiful seed here, which is pretty much indestructible. You can crush it into tiny pieces, but it won't rot, it can't be eaten. And it's a really beautiful way of preserving very detailed plant structures. And some of the amazing things that we have found in the sequence, apart from wood and other pollen, we have found these tiny fossils called mesofossils, because they're about 1 millimeter in size, this one on the left, which was worked on by a specialist, a lady called Helen Eklund, who was a specialist on fossil plants and flowers. And she took some of this charcoal that was found in Antarctica, and she discovered that a lot of it represented flowers in the past. So we also have fossil flowers. So you can see on the left this little vase-like body with a cap on the top. And that's really incredibly similar to, if you like, eucalyptus or gum trees living present day. So here you can see an Australian gum tree with its cap coming off and the flower coming out of here. So this is really very early types of plants from the family Myrtaceae, which is sort of eucalyptus type. And we have flowers of Winteraceae and other southern hemisphere flowers in charcoal. We also have many sort of leaves and branches, and this nodule on the left shows a whole branch of you can see of a monkey puzzle type tree, even with the leaves still attached, and you can see cellular structure in this. You can see the wood type with the leaves attached. And a student, Rosie Carpenter, who worked on that, she could identify these fossils, you know, that are sort of 100 million years, 70 million years old, as almost identical to Araucaria araucana monkey puzzle tree. And they grow in these amazing national parks in Chile in the Andes. One of the most amazing places I've ever visited is the volcanic region in Chile, and you go up in the high mountains, and there's incredible national parks that are just full of these really ancient looking, really like dinosaur territory of these monkey puzzle trees living in the foothills of these volcanoes. And then there's small trees, you can see small trees below them, which is southern beech, which is also very common in Antarctica. So I'm sure this is probably what our land area in Antarctica looked like at that point, with these monkey puzzle trees on the highlands with the volcanoes. So here's another of Robert Nichols' paintings. And this is one that was based on some work that robust geologists have done in the past, and also Jodie Howe, who was a PhD student with me in Leeds. And we had a fantastic time sitting with Rob, and he was picking our brains about what this forest looked like. So this is a forest that's 100 million years old. And what Jodie did was she went to Antarctica. She had a sequence of rocks in which she was seeing tree stumps in their original growth position, fossil tree stumps. And she saw rootlets in the rocks. She saw fossil leaves in the rocks. And she very carefully mapped where she found them. And what she reconstructed was this incredibly accurate reconstruction of an Antarctic forest 100 million years ago, mid-Cretaceous. So you can see in the distance, you can see the Antarctic Peninsula with our erupting volcanoes, so sort of the Chilean Andes equivalent. And then this forest shows these trees in their growth position. So there's the ginkgo tree, the maidenhair tree here, a southern maidenhair tree there. So we've got leaves here. And if you come to Bass, we have to display with all these leaves and fossils on show. A southern hemisphere conifer, like a podocarp. And then monkey puzzle trees here, which were quite common in these forests, as they are actually all over the world in the past, in the Mesozoic. And then we have tree ferns, cycads, proper ferns, and then these strange plants here in the undergrowth, which are were extinct during the Cretaceous. There were no flowers in this forest because I think probably last week you heard Peter Crane talk, and Peter would have talked about the origin of the angiosperms, I presume. And angiosperms really didn't appear in Antarctica until a bit later in the Cretaceous. So 100 million years, they were just about arriving in Antarctica. So on some of these logs down here, you can see liverworts and mosses, and just small plants in the undergrowth, but no major flowering plants. And some of you might know what I'm going to say next, because you may have heard this. So when Robert, and the artist, and I were talking about this, he said, well, what lived in these forests? Where are the animals? And so I asked him to do a couple of little eyes in the undergrowth, just to show that there must have been animals living in here. I mean, it's a very verdant, lush forest, but we've never found fossils in here, probably because it's really quite an acidic environment, and there are lots of seams of coal in here where all the plant material has been preserved, and that's probably an acidic environment which has dissolved bones. So he did put an animal in here, and if I could see the audience, I'd get you to guess where it is. But so there it is here. I'll tell you where it is. Just here's a dinosaur hiding behind this tree stump, well camouflaged. And this is a small dinosaur, which is about 9 meters long, herbivorous, vegetarian dinosaur. It's a bit like a big turkey. And we found the bones not in this particular forest, but we found them further up in the peninsula as well. So we have the jaw bones and some of the bones of this dinosaur. And we know that this type of dinosaur actually roamed across Gondwana. So it roamed across Antarctica and into Australia at this time when the continents were joined. So for any of you young geologists, paleontologists in the audience, there is still a challenge to go to these places in Antarctica and find the fossils that will prove these animals were here. So the plants that we find in Antarctica, the plant fossils, not surprisingly, I guess, we think are the ancestors of the Southern Hemisphere vegetation. So Anne-Marie Tossolini, Dave Cantrell and I have worked on a whole suite of fossil plants that we've collected from Antarctica over the years. And you can see, so here's that leaf. This is southern beech, Nothofagus. Southern beech, like a beech leaf, but a different type that grows in the Southern Hemisphere. And this is really a very common tree in Antarctic forests. We have Proteaceae. So this is the leaf here, and Proteaceae are those big waxy plants that you see that grow sometimes in South Africa and in Australia. Very strange looking flowers, but they were probably in Antarctica as well. And then some of these more tropical types with this, here's one brachychiton with a kite-shaped leaf that we see here. And we see many types of plants, both as leaves and pollen and wood and flowers that are growing in the Southern Hemisphere vegetation today, but were present in Antarctica millions of years ago. And the flowering plants sort of appear about 80 million years ago and then increased in number up to today. So another artist that we've worked with more recently, James Mackay, he worked with us on younger sediments. So this is about 70 million years ago. So Antarctica 70 million years ago, the vegetation did contain flowering plants. So you can see here again, this scene looks a bit like the Andes, or it actually looks a bit like South Island, New Zealand, because I think this is what South Island, New Zealand looks like today. And I think Antarctica was probably very similar in the past. So we've got monkey puzzle trees up here in the highland areas, just like there are in Chile and in New Zealand today. And then when you come down to the rivers and waterways, you can see southern beech here. You still can see some ferns and some tree ferns. Over here, there's some red, I'm just going to get rid of the screen. There's some red flowers of Proteaceae. We have around here a lot of water plants. We have a lot of ferns. We have, this is from the pollen now. We even have gunnera. So if you go to a botanical garden and you see these huge umbrella-like plants, like huge rhubarb with spiky stems, and we have gunnera there. There's two types in the Southern Hemisphere, a small one that lives on the Falkland Islands, but we have the big one. And so that must have been quite dramatic. And we have a lot of small plants that live here in the water, and we have heathers and other types that grow, heath plants that grow up in the highlands. And we also have a lot of dinosaurs as well, even right up to the end of the Cretaceous. So these are, of course, they didn't all probably live together in this kind of scene, but these are dinosaurs that American and Argentine colleagues have worked on. So we have the sauropods here, we've got their footprints. We've had the hadrosaurs here, Tyrannosaurus type things, the Stegosaurus type dinosaurs, probably the avian type dinosaurs as well, and lots of ducks. So we've got ducks in Antarctica in the late Cretaceous, and a lot of other birds too. So a really lively place with dinosaurs that you would find in other parts of the world, and a really sort of verdant scene just before the end of the Cretaceous. Now, of course, at the end of the Cretaceous, all the non-avian dinosaurs died out. The avian bird-like dinosaurs continued, and they continued in Antarctica. And in some places in the world, there is a change in the plant types, but we really don't see that in Antarctica at all. The same plants continue through the sequence, and we see them into the younger sediments, but also, of course, into present day. So again, another reconstruction. This is by colleagues in the American Museum of Natural History who worked on a small island called Seymour Island, where we also worked on the Antarctic Peninsula region. but they worked on younger sediments. And these younger sediments, of course, no dinosaur bones anymore, but still the same plants. So we have here Southern Beech, we have here Winteraceae, we have here the monkey puzzle trees, same vegetation. But instead of dinosaurs, we have possums, marsupials, common in about 50 million years ago, Eocene times. We have these big mammals called Gondwanatheres. I like to think of them as primitive llamas, but probably not. But I mean, they're somewhere along the line, llamas must have appeared. There's these huge carnivorous birds, the rheas, which were common in South America at that time, and they were called the terror birds because they were carnivorous. So that would have been a formidable thing to meet in the dark on Seymour Island. And then down here on the beach, you can see these little spots, and these are penguins, because when we look for fossil plants about 50 million years ago, so Eocene was quite warm again, we find the same in the same bed of rock as there are fossil leaves that show us the climate was at least warm temperate. We also find the bones of many, many species of penguins. And so these have been worked on by Argentine colleagues, especially Carolina there. And you can see that, so she's drawn them to size. So here's this Carolina from 60 centimeters tall. And here's an emperor penguin. Emperor penguins are quite tall, quite chubby, tall beasts. We have lots of small penguins as well. But the bones that we find on Seymour Island show that there were several species of giant penguins that lived in Antarctica when the climate was much warmer. So, you know, everybody thinks that penguins are creatures of the ice, and that's absolutely not the case at all. There were many species of penguins across the world at that time, but particularly in Antarctica. And here you go. So this one here, you see here, I'm cuddling this tall plastic penguin, which is a big model in the Swedish Museum of Natural History. And this was found by an ancient explorer called Nordenskjöld, and he found penguin bones when he was there in the turn of the century. He was shipwrecked there for 2 years, and he found the metatarsals, or the foot bones of penguins, and he reconstructed them as 6 foot high penguins. So somebody said it either means the penguins were 6 foot high, or they were normal size and they had very big feet. But they've been usually reconstructed as these very tall penguins, because there are other species now that we found both around the Southern Hemisphere, many continents now. So here for comparison, you can see the small ones that we know of. So, you know, they're just small penguins now, but look at all these huge fossil penguins that used to live on the Earth, and particularly in Antarctica millions of years ago, 50 million years ago. And of course, there are still penguins around the world. They live in South Africa, they live in the Galapagos, they live in South Australia, they live in Melbourne, actually, on the beach in Melbourne. So there's lots of small penguins around, and only some call it the hardy ones, or maybe the foolhardy ones like the emperor penguin, live in Antarctica today in the cold. So that was the warmth of Antarctica. But what happened about 40 million years ago, we see, well, in rocks of 40 million years old, we start seeing signs of ice. We see rock cores with glacial diamictites. So we see drop stones and evidence that there was an ice sheet on Antarctica about 40 million years ago. So there must have been ice actually at the margins and beyond by that time. And probably what happened is there's belief now that carbon dioxide levels naturally were decreasing at that time, and the Earth was getting cooler. But what I think was a really critical event was the tectonic plates around Antarctica moved, and they broke apart Gondwana, and the continents really started separating. So the date of the sort of separation is usually said to be about 20 million years ago. And so so Australia had moved away, South Africa had moved away a long time ago, and that last break was between the South America from Patagonia to the Antarctic Peninsula. And we know that around here now, there's a very deep channel, and we can see the tectonic plate really is deformed around here. And as soon as that broke open, and there's lots of studies about how this deep channel formed and then really deepened, and then the ocean currents could flow around Antarctica. And then, so as soon as that happened, the currents just stayed flowing around Antarctica. They didn't go northwards, they didn't warm up near the equator, they just stayed around Antarctica, and they became colder and colder, and they trapped Antarctica in a kind of icy tomb. And so the polar front is a very distinct front that exists today. You can even see the change in the water color as you sail from say the Falklands here across the polar front. You can see the change in the color of the water and the temperature of the water and the temperature of the climate as you cross there. So Antarctica became really cold and icy, and there's evidence of ice caps have formed 40 million years ago, probably earlier. One day I'll tell you about Cretaceous ice, but that's another story. So it used to be believed that once the ice formed, all the plants disappeared, but that's not quite the case. And the plants continued in Antarctica. And this is a picture here. The background is the Beardmore Glacier in Antarctica. So we're going to a totally different place now. We are going to the Transantarctic Mountains. And this is the Beardmore Glacier that Scott and Shackleton went up to on their expeditions, and where Scott and his men went to try and get to the South Pole and came back down here. And in fact, they collected fossil plants from the other side of the Beardmore Glacier here, not this side near me, down here. And they found Permian Glossopteris leaves. But over this side, which is much more difficult to get to unless you have a helicopter, you see there's some sediments here. And in the 80s, American geologists were looking for something completely different, and they found these fossil leaves. So here again, you can see a little beech leaf, southern beech, about 2 centimeters long, beautiful folding of the veins on the leaf. And these really are what we now know as probably the last forests in Antarctica. The climate was cool, and these trees survived. So this is a place called Oliver Bluffs. And you can see the bluffs are this sort of motley rock here. And this is a diamictite. It's a glacial sediment that was formed by an ice stream that was ploughing down from the South Pole, which is over here to the right. And it ploughed its way down through this valley here and churned up a lot of rocks on the way down and deposited them here. You can see some rough layers in different spells of glaciation in this region. So this site here is only 300 miles from the South Pole. This is the last bit of rock before you get to the polar plateau. And probably at that time, it was also 300 miles from the South Pole. So we are really in a sort of polar situation now and in the past. And what you find in these rocks is you find these tiny, tiny little twigs. So I'm holding just a piece of twig, and you can see these little brown areas in here. So between these layers of glacial sediment, there are these, you can see these sort of fine flat bed here of silt and gravel. And these represent periods in this glacial phase when the glaciation came to a halt. The glaciers probably retreated a little bit, and we had an interglacial phase where the temperatures warmed and little bushes of southern beech were able to colonize this area. So there must have been trees elsewhere, perhaps at lower altitudes or nearer the coast. And when there were these warm periods, the trees moved inland a bit, quite close to the South Pole. And then their remains are preserved here, and they're actually in situ. So we can see them rooted in these soils, and then the glaciers pushed more sediment over the top of them as the glaciers advanced again in another cold period. And these little twigs, you see, they're about the size of your little finger. This one here, when I cut them open and looked at them, the tree rings show that they were hundreds of years old. So these are tiny little bushes growing really, really slowly in a very cold environment. And then also between the layers of these rocks, you can see these mats of these little beech leaves, 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters long. So these again, southern beech, growing in a tundra-like environment next to glaciers millions of years ago. Now, the dating of this sequence is really difficult because dating glacial rocks is very tricky. There's very few indicators of age. So they could be anywhere between 3 to 10 or even older million years old. There's still some work to be done there. But clearly there was just enough warmth, probably about 5 degrees summer temperature, to allow these bushes to grow intermittently in warm periods a few million years ago. And we haven't drawn a picture of that one yet. I must talk to Rob Nichols to paint a picture of that. But this is probably what Antarctica looked like at that time. Now, this is a picture of modern day Mount Field in Tasmania, in the highlands of Tasmania. And I think it was very similar to what Antarctica looked like at the time of the last forests. So just a few million years ago, Antarctica would have looked like this as the glaciers retreated a little bit towards the South Pole, because in this vegetation here, you have all the plants that we have in Antarctica in those last forests. So there are many small bushes here of southern beech, Nothofagus. There's some podocarps that we also find, podocarp pollen that we also find there. And we find cushion plants and little plants that lived in very cold environments, in a tundra-like environment, just like this. And we've estimated from the fossils that the temperature was quite similar, probably mean annual temperature of 3 or 5 degrees. So very cold in the winter, but just warm enough in the summer for the plants to survive. So Antarctica a few million years ago wasn't covered with huge ice caps like it is now. It was covered in some ice, but it had plants and open ground around the edges. So this time zone is now known roughly as the Pliocene, could be Miocene, but let's call it the Pliocene. And that is now become extremely significant in understanding climate change. So about 20 years ago, I think it was 15 to 20 years ago, there was a really big project called the PRISM project, in which geologists from the UK, the US and many other nations got together, and they collected as much geological information as they could about the Pliocene, the middle Pliocene epoch, so about 3 to 5 million years ago. And they did this at that time because climate models were beginning to get more sophisticated, and we needed a geological reconstruction to test the results of climate models, which were then used to predict the future. And so this is what the PRISM project was for at that time. It was to collect geological information, to build up maps of the geological information, and to see whether climate models were good enough to match the geological information. And what the PRISM project showed is, so here's a reconstruction of some of the data they collected. So for 3 million years ago, Pliocene, you can see in Antarctica, they did it for the whole Earth, and they have the most amazing results, and it's the most amazing data bank, really. But you can see the reconstruction of the geological data shows a much reduced ice cap. It's really only the West Antarctic ice cap here. So South Pole's around here, and there was ice at the South Pole, but also over here because it's the highest continental area. And then around the margins, you can see that the elevation was much lower, and this was probably just open ground. And that little red star is where those last forests came from that I just showed you. It's just right on the edge of the ice cap, probably. And for the Pliocene globally, what the PRISM database showed really that the ice sheet on Antarctica was much reduced. The Arctic had very little ice at all at that point, and global sea levels were about 10 to 20 meters higher. So there's a lot of work that was in the Pliocene on looking at ancient shorelines and ancient sea levels and the geological markers of ancient sea levels, of higher sea level. And the estimate for the Pliocene sea level is 10 to 20 meters higher than it is today. And the estimates also were that global temperatures were 2 to 3 degrees higher than today. And we'll come to the CO2 level in a moment. So the Pliocene showed us that Antarctica was beginning to cool and affect the global climates and affect everything in the globe at that time. And then as we come into present day, so we go from the Pliocene 3 million years ago to today, and this is a view from my bedroom window. If I go to Rothera Station in Antarctica, one of our stations in Antarctica, it's just an amazing place to be on a good day. And after about 3 million years, the whole Earth cooled. So the Earth, there was so much ice in Antarctica and so much cooling that and carbon dioxide levels were dropping. And the ice started building up in the Arctic as well. And the Arctic Ocean started to freeze. And we came into what I guess a lot of people call the Ice Age that we know of today, when the Earth's poles are both Earth poles are covered in ice. And so let's talk about what people do today to understand the Earth in with a polar climate that is icy as opposed to warm. So there's a lot of research at the moment about the history of the ice sheet. So when you get to about, when you get to about 1 million years, or a bit less than that at the moment, 800,000 years ago, the Earth, the polar regions were covered in thick ice. And the best record of what happened over the last 800,000 years of geological time is found in the ice sheets, because they record almost an annual pattern. You can get this in marine sediments as well, but the ice sheets tell you a lot about atmosphere and climate on a very detailed record. So here are some of my colleagues, or it's an international team, and they are, you see, here's a drill, an ice core drill, which they have horizontally, but then they tip vertically and they drill down into a hole into the ice sheet. And they can get the history of the ice sheet, so the history of the last 800,000 years, by looking at the ice core. So there's an ice core over here, you can see, that's been brought up, and they cut into meter lengths and brought back to the UK or wherever they're going. And then they're sliced even thinner into these very thin slabs, which are quite well dated. And they're used for analysis to understand what the climate is. At the moment, there's a huge project going on in Antarctica. It's just stopped for the winter, actually, called Beyond Epica. So the first big ice core project was called Epica, a European ice core drilling, or the second one. And there's a new one, international project called Beyond Epica, where they're trying to drill ice that's at least 1 million years old, or even 1.5 million years old, to get the history of Earth's climate going back a bit further. So when you get these slabs of ice, the most amazing thing about them is that they have these tiny bubbles in the ice. So as the snow falls, it traps air from the atmosphere of the time of the ice fall and into these tiny bubbles. And this, inside each bubble, there is ice, there is atmosphere from the day that snow fell. So you can go back 800,000 years into a piece of ice and crack the ice, and what comes out is the atmosphere 800,000 years old. And if I gave you a piece of ice of that old and you hold it in your hand, as it begins to melt, you can hear it, and you hold it to your ear, you can hear it crackle. It's like Rice Krispies type crackling as those bubbles pop, as they release the pressure and as the ice melts. And that's what the sound of Antarctica is, actually. If I go to Antarctica in the summer and walk along the shoreline of our station in Rothera, that picture I showed you, on a sunny day, the sound of Antarctica is this sound of Rice Krispie crackling of all this ancient atmosphere being released from the ice that's coming off of the glaciers nearby. So the glaciologists can date these slabs of ice, and they can take out the atmosphere, and they measure the carbon dioxide in the small bubbles. This is the only real measurement of ancient atmosphere that you can get, this atmosphere in the ice cores. Everything else is a proxy, or it's a sort of a different kind of a data recording of it. But this is the real atmosphere. And they've measured the atmosphere and they've measured the temperature from the water. And this is a very, very famous graph that shows the history of climate over the last 800,000 years. And I have this graph here in Bass, and we've shown it to ministers and politicians, and take some time explaining to them. And this is the one graph that really convinces them that we need to do something about climate change. So not everybody is scared of graphs, and so it really works. And this is the one thing they take a picture of when they leave. So well done for the people who drew this graph. So if you're not familiar with it, this is here's today, going back in time 800,000 years. So that's where the ice core has been drilled back to. And all those slabs of rock have yielded data. So they've been measured almost year by year in terms of temperature in the water and concentration of carbon dioxide in the bubbles in the ice. And you can see immediately that there are these distinct cycles. These are about 100,000 years across. So the warming and the cooling here, and the changes, the waxing and waning of the ice sheet in the ice age was due to the relationships of the Earth to the sun, warming and cooling. But you can see that temperature relates to climate, to CO2. So this is one of the first times that people realize that temperature and CO2 were related, and there's a distinct relationship. But the really critical thing about this, so realize this is during the ice age, and there was ice on Earth all this time. And even though the ice sheet was waxing and waning, and there was some change in temperature, the carbon dioxide level of the Earth for the last 800,000 years has never risen above 300 parts per million. So we have been for a very long time in this stable world of less than 300 parts per million carbon dioxide, from about 180 to 300. And this is where we are now. So a lot of this is roughly about the start of the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, and then we're going almost straight up on the scale on this graph, way up. Historical records that we've measured, historical, and today the CO2 measurement today is 417 parts per million. So we're way, way, way above that stability that we had when there was ice on Earth. And to some extent, then what we've measured in the past, and when there's ice on Earth, it's out of kilter now with a 400 parts per million world. So we need to go back again to the Pliocene, and when was the last 400 parts per million world? It was the Pliocene. We know that there was 400 parts per million roughly of CO2 on Earth. So this gives us a good indication that global temperatures will at 400 parts per million will end up being 2 to 3 degrees higher, and that we might expect sea levels 10 to 20 meters higher than today. So just to finish off, here's another picture. This is by James Mackay and Alan Hayward, who worked on the PRISM project, got together with James very recently. I'm not even sure this is published yet, but this is looking forward now. So to some extent, so they drew a picture from PRISM data of what Greenland looked like about 3 million years ago in the Pliocene at 400 parts per million. So this is Greenland, which today, of course, doesn't have stripy animals, and it doesn't have heather and plants on it. So probably about 3 million years ago, with 400 parts per million, they estimate from the geological data that they collected in the PRISM record that there were probably valley glaciers down to here, but certainly not the big ice sheets of Greenland today. And they've got birds here. So these are great auks, the northern equivalent of our penguins. And they have here these little, well, horses really, stripy horses that we find as fossils, and a northern hemisphere type vegetation, which is very different from the southern hemisphere type. So again, kind of tundra environments, less ice, higher sea levels, and much warmer climate than now. So I guess my message is, I think at 400 parts per million, we're not really in a stable world where we can have ice sheets like this. Again, this is in Rothera, having a beautiful ice scenery. This is not really stable with a 400 parts per million world. And the Earth is now, I think, in a phase of catching up. The landscape is catching up with a 400 parts per million world. And we really now can go back into the geological past to try and understand what our future is like. So I think more power to the geologists and those people looking in the past, because we can look back to really see where our future is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. Chris is going to take over on the questioning, but could I ask you something that puzzles lots of botanists? And this is this business of day length and high latitudes. And so one can accept the fact that you might have vegetation quite similar to the plants we have around today at high latitudes. But we've always thought of the conifers as being able to do it because they live there, because they don't lose their leaves, but they're very small and they have all sorts of adaptations. But then when you come to the flowering plants, do you think, well, the flowering plants that you showed are ones that I believe are mostly evergreen, that come from Australia. Do you think that the late appearance of angiosperms in these higher latitudes was actually something to do with their acclimatizing to these changes in day length, which are so important when certain groups for their flowering and so on?
They might have been. I mean, the plants are I think all the plants that grow there are quite well adapted to living in these, in the high latitude light conditions. And certainly there were similar plants in the Arctic as well, although not quite so high latitude. I think partly, Diane, we need to look for more angiosperms in these older rocks. So there are the first beginnings of angiosperm leaves that we can identify clearly as angiosperms at about 100 million years. That's when the first angiosperm leaf has been reported. I think we run out of the record a bit then after that. So we need to find some slightly older Cretaceous rock with plants in to be able to find them. I'm not sure if would they respond to the daylight. I don't think there's a problem. But I did some experiments.
Darkness, isn't it? Chlorophyll doesn't like darkness too much.
No, it doesn't. And I think the plants just must have gone into dormancy. So we did some experiments with David Beerling in the Sheffield and Colin Osborne, and what they found was that both even the conifers and the angiosperms had sort of traits that could adapt to living in a very seasonal climate. So they looked at I can't remember now the detail, but they looked at the carbon and their response and to some greenhouse experiments, and they just found that both were adapted to living in a very seasonal environment. So there wasn't much difference between the two.
Thank you. Chris.
Diane, can I just quickly ask a quick question, if I may, while before we get into the Q&As on the written questions? Sorry, the giant Eocene penguin, the 6-foot penguin, what did for it? Kind of what I mean, you would imagine it was quite adapted in terms of being able to fish and swim deep and hold its breath for longer and so forth. But why did it die out as we called?
Well, I'm not sure. You'd have to ask my Argentine colleagues who've worked on that. There's lots of different species. There are lots of different ones. I guess being large, there were a lot of large creatures, weren't they, in that time in the colder climates. And I think just competition probably, and just that they were able to live in warmer, the ones that survive live in warmer climates, and maybe having a large body size isn't something that's really quite good to have in a cold climate. So I think the emperor penguin is the largest, well, certainly the largest penguins we have today, and probably some of the largest birds around.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, that was going to be our first question in the
was it? Oh, sorry.
from Aidan, who's age 10. And Aidan wanted to know why the penguins were so big. So I suppose you've more or less answered that.
Well, I suppose they must have had, I mean, to go big, you don't have competitors, do you? And you don't have predators, and you must have plenty of food. So I think there's probably plenty of fish in the sea, and the oceans were warm, and there was plenty to eat. So I think it was probably a good place for penguins to live. And there were lots of species. The geologists have reconstructed a lot of penguin species at that time. So I think it was quite a flourishing sort of colony of all types of penguins. But I mean, they still live around the world, don't they? I mean, smaller ones, but you can find them in the Galapagos. You can find them in South Africa. You can see colonies. You can see them in the Falkland Islands. And interestingly, of course, they don't live on the ice. They live in burrows in the ground. So if you go to South Africa, if you go to the Falklands, there's the king penguins live in the Falklands and on South Georgia in the sub-Antarctic, but they live in the Falklands. They live in burrows in the ground. So I can't imagine the big penguins of the Eocene living in burrows in the ground in Antarctica. They would be rather large burrows, wouldn't they? So probably not.
Okay, brilliant. So we've got two things running at the moment. The Q&A is probably the best place to put questions, please. So we've got a question from Jenny Pike, who asks about the tiny notophagus twigs. I guess are these the equivalent of in the Arctic? I'm very familiar with the dwarf birches, and here we have dwarf southern beeches. So
yes,
very interesting. You said they were from bushes hundreds of years old. That's what you did say. I was amazed by that. Has anyone looked at the tree rings to look at seasonality, or are they just too thin? They must be minute.
Yes, they are. So there's a paper published, Chris and Jenny, if you want to see it. Yes, I worked with Bob Hill on this. So yeah, so in the Arctic there are Arctic willows, very similar. So when I worked in the Arctic, I collected a lot of those and had a look at some of those tree rings. And they're very similar to the notophagus. So like I said, I sectioned quite a lot of those small twigs from Antarctica, the southern beach. And again, yes, you can just about count the rings, but they are minute. But yeah, I was counting well over 100 in many of those small twiglets.
How many cells per increment?
Hardly any. And, yeah. I mean, it would have been a very short growing season, and in the Arctic, the trees don't necessarily grow every year. They wait till they're the right temperatures, and then they grow and have little bursts, and just enough. And when the summers were warm enough to sort of reproduce, then they would grow a bit faster. But you definitely can see good growth rings. And the other thing that was very interesting as well is that when you have little roots or branches that cling close to the ground, there's a very distinct ring structure, which shows how the rings are able to sort of spread out wider upwards, even though they're going along the ground. And then at the ground level, on the side growing on the ground, they're very cramped and together, or they don't form any cells at all. And you could see exactly those same kind of signatures of in the fossil beach from Antarctica. You could see that they were clinging very close to the ground. They're really impoverished trees. They live in frozen soil most of the time. They would have lived in very bitter winds, so that they didn't sort of stick their heads up above the landscape very much, and very nutrient poor in frozen ground. So growing very, very slowly indeed. But remarkable little things, and there's a great signature in there of their growth and how they clung on in these difficult conditions.
Brilliant. A question for me: we've discussed day length, but what about the implication of a long Arctic winter for the entire ecosystem? I mean, with dinosaurs and all these sorts of things. I mean, how did they cope with a long period of darkness?
So there was a huge amount of debate about this some years ago, because particularly for the similar dinosaurs that were found in Australia.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, in Australia, and you will see some publications which sort of suggested, how did the dinosaurs survive at these high latitudes when it got cold and dark, because if the trees did shed their leaves, or there wouldn't be much food around, let alone the cold. Although it probably wasn't huge, it wasn't freezing cold in the winters in the Cretaceous. I think it was cold because otherwise the plants would not survive, because they would carry on growing in the dark. They would respire and use up all their plant stores. So the idea is actually that the plants couldn't move, so the plants survived. They probably went dormant in the winters and waited for the summer sun to come back. But the animals that lived there, particularly the dinosaurs, the idea was that they probably moved away. They probably migrated into lower latitudes, which they could have done certainly in Australia, and into warmer climes. There were some ideas that they probably hibernated, but it's very hard to imagine a sort of dinosaur hibernating. Actually, I mean, quite big beast. How do you hibernate? Dig a big hole? Dig a big burrow? Probably not. So I think they probably moved maybe in herd-like areas and just went to lower latitudes where it was a little bit warmer.
Okay. Thank you. So we got a question about the pollen data and not having any flowering plants. Do you have pollen but no flowering plants? Is this coming from conifers? Is it coming from a long distance away?
So there is. Well, we've worked on the pollen. When we've done really intense pollen studies, it's actually from the later part of the Cretaceous when there would have been angiosperms around. So I haven't done a lot of palynology from pre-angiosperm times, to be honest. But we do have. So we do see the angiosperms come in and diversify through the sort of latest Cretaceous and into the Cenozoic that we have them there. Yeah. And they do give us, Vanessa Bowman worked on this, and they do give us a really interesting picture of the other plants that lived in the forests that we just don't see as leaves or wood, and the kind of things that you would normally see in the undergrowth and small plants in the Southern Hemisphere.
Okay. And in the chat, there's quite a discussion as to whether higher temperatures and higher CO2 was a good thing or a bad thing.
In the past or now?
Yeah, I think that's, yes, they've had that discussion between themselves. From my point of view, absolutely fascinating talk to hear the role of paleobotany in understanding the Earth system and understanding really how it works and how it might work and how it did work. And that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you ever so much. I'm now going to hand over to Ian Hall.
Hi, Jane. I just wanted to take a moment, actually, if I may, and just say thank you on behalf of everyone in the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences. When I started as head of school in 2014, this is just for the audience, I had the idea of bringing together an external advisory group. And you heard right at the beginning from Diane's introduction how esteemed Jane is. And I was very pleased that Jane agreed to become part of that external advisory group. And really, I remember the first meeting that we had where we brought everyone together, and I rather nervously presented the school and particularly the challenges that we faced at the time. And I'd just like to say thank you. The warmth and the generosity and really the outstanding strategic advice you gave at that point has really changed the school and put us on the direction we're on today. So I really do appreciate that. And just on behalf of everyone in the school, just say thank you very much for that. Really very much appreciated.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And are you finished, Ian? Because for me,
that's
done. Thank
only
you.
Quick, yeah.
Thank you for that, Ian. I remember it well. And finally, Diane.
Well, obviously, as a paleobotanist, I'm extremely grateful to people like Jane, who actually now still manage to get money for our science, which is quite a challenge. Thank you very much on my part too. Now, next time, I'm really hoping that we will have a lecture in the department, the school here in Cardiff. I think we'll probably leave it for a little while because people are, like me, are still hesitant about meeting in large groups. But I'm hoping that Chris Jackson, when he comes to talk about volcanoes, next time, it will be in the school. I should say that we have persuaded the university to lift the barriers in one of our car parks for our Wednesday night talks. So if those of you who before used to park near main building, you could now go to the Butte building, which is across the Memorial Gardens, and in the car park of the Butte building, there is a barrier, but it will be raised during the period of these lectures for our next lecture, should it be in Cardiff. But please, will you keep an eye on our website, and we will let you know as soon as possible whether or not it will be here. But, well, the last time I saw Chris Jackson, I think actually it was in a cookery program when he was a judge on the Great British Menu. But this versatile man also camps inside volcanoes. Now, if that is quite a voyage, almost to the center of the earth, you can learn all about it if you turn up and listen to him on March the 8th. So thank you for listening to us, listening tonight to Jane, and big thank you for Jane giving up her time for us. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.